Can I take questions 1 to 8 together? I attended the summit between the European Union and the League of Arab States from the 24th to the 25th of February in Sharm el-Sheikh. The purpose of the summit was to deepen and extend the partnership between the EU and Arab countries, enabling us to tackle our many shared challenges more effectively. The summit was the first meeting between leaders of the two regions ever and marked an important milestone in our efforts to deepen the partnership. Stronger EU-Arab cooperation is required if we are to find effective and sustainable solutions to regional challenges such as migration, terrorism and radicalisation. It's also essential in countering the many threats to regional peace and security, including conflicts and humanitarian crises in Syria, Yemen, Libya and Sudan. At the summit, EU and Arab leaders agreed a joint political declaration which restated our commitment to resolving regional problems through robust, rules-based multilateral systems. The declaration also included important commitments on promoting human rights, countering incitement to hatred, xenophobia and intolerance. It restated our shared position on issues including the Middle East peace process and nuclear non-proliferation. As well as participating at the summit, I had the opportunity to meet several Arab leaders with whom I discussed bilateral relations and Ireland's candidature for the Security Council. And I met with the Egyptian President, the Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, the Deputy Prime Minister of Oman, the Foreign Minister of Jordan and the Emir of Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates. I also had a brief discussion with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. And I also took an opportunity to discuss EU matters, including Brexit, with my colleagues from the EU Council, met with Prime Minister May and spoke informally with Presidents Tusk and Juncker. And I did again at the Council on the 21st, 22nd of March. I didn't have any specific meetings with Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, on either occasion, but I did have the opportunity to speak with him briefly on marge of the EU League of Arab Summit and indeed at the European Council last week, as I did with most other heads of state and government.
Howlin.
In relation to the dialogue with the Arab League states, whether you discussed the use of Libya as a state to deal with the migrant crisis. There's been extraordinary revelations of human rights abuses in Libya. The European Union now is funding the development and building up of a coast guard in Libya to intercept potential migrants coming across the Mediterranean and repatriating them or bringing them back to what have been described as unspeakable conditions in Libya. Was this matter discussed? Will there be a European Union oversight of the appalling human rights conditions and abuses that apparently are going on in some of the holding centres in Libya? In relation to the ongoing and appalling humanitarian crisis in Yemen, was that matter discussed? And will there be concerted European Union action to deal with the situation where Saudi Arabia, backed by a number of other Sunni Muslim governments, is in conflict with militia or supporting militia in Yemen, backed by Iran, and the humanitarian cost of that conflict is again an unspeakable tragedy. And is there any initiative to be taken by the European Union to deal with that issue? And finally, if I could ask you in relation to the recent declaration by the United States to effectively endorse the annexation of the Golan Heights in Syria. I welcome the announcement of the Taoiseach in that regard. Is there a joint EU initiative in relation to that matter?
Deputy Haughey.
Well, obviously, Brexit is dominating the discussion both here and at EU level at this time for obvious reasons, and rightly so. But I think it's important that we don't take our eye off the ball in relation to a number of other issues. At the May European Council Summit in Romania to come, a strategic agenda will be prepared for the period 2019 and 2024. And I'd like to know what Ireland's position will be in that regard. I think the pre-Council Council statements at that time will be terribly important so that the Dáil is fully informed of the situation. Earlier this month we had the Vision for Europe outlined by President Macron in an opinion piece published in 28 EU states. He seemed to be suggesting that sovereignty be pooled in new areas and that we should proceed with closer integration. I'm just wondering what Ireland's view is in relation to the vision set out by President Macron. I know that's a detailed answer is needed there, but if you could give some indication as to the views of Ireland in that regard. And finally, just in relation to the migration issue, the Taoiseach mentioned that the aim was to improve partnership between the EU and the League of Arab States. Some nation states are struggling to promote democracy and economic development. Climate change is a big issue for many of these states. I think it's the right thing to do, to support these nation states, but it's also in the EU's interest to do so from the point of view of migration. We need to address the root causes of migration. 1.5 million refugees came to the EU from Syria in 2015. Other humanitarian crises have been mentioned here during the course of this discussion. Would you agree that it's very important that Ireland will play a crucial role in resolving these issues on a humanitarian level, given our record as regards these issues? Thank you.
Barrett.
This time last year, just coming up for Land Day, I warned you that the Israelis were preparing to attack the Great March of Return protests planned in Gaza. At the time, I don't think you even answered me the first couple of times I raised it. Subsequently, what I said in advance of those protests was there was likely to be hundreds of Palestinians killed. That turned out to be the case, more than 200, 18,000 injured. It went on for months. Now, Land Day is coming up at the end of this week. Further protests are planned by the people of Gaza to vindicate their right under international law to return to the homes and villages from which they were expelled in 1948. And Israel is already giving the signs that it's going to do the same again as it did last year. More innocent Palestinian blood as the Israelis seek to deny the Palestinians their rights under international law. And at the same time, Donald Trump, in defiance of international law, legitimises the illegal annexation by Israel of the Golan Heights of sovereign Syrian territory. Now, I just wonder, did you discuss at the Arab League meeting the likelihood that this situation could escalate into violence again because of justified, legitimate protests by the people of Gaza to vindicate their rights, and about the behaviour of Donald Trump in legitimising the annexation of Jerusalem, of the Golan Heights, and of his systematic denial of Palestinian rights? And is the European Union going to do anything more than they did last year about the likely killing of innocent Palestinians?
Deputy Martin.
As Deputy Haughey said, Brexit is a topic on a later question and for the session on statements, so I want to just focus on some specific matters here. The Syrian conflict has had an impact on the Middle East which will last for many years and has directly led to the largest humanitarian emergency of our time. I think the Assad regime's brutal suppression of dissent, the added ferocity of attacks since Russia began taking a leading role, has caused a displacement of people, which is causing immense hardship on the people involved and real pressure on neighbouring countries. Can you tell us, Taoiseach, if any matters were discussed to assist countries such as Jordan and Lebanon, who host the largest refugee camps in the world and currently see no prospect of helping people to return home, given the attitude of the Syrian regime towards opponents? In relation to the Mediterranean, Taoiseach, you will be aware of reports that the number of migrants attempting crossings on both of the main routes are down, on the historic highs, but are rising again, and there are obvious and dramatic failings in the response, particularly in relation to Libya, as Deputy Howlin has alluded to. Did you make any statement, Taoiseach, about how people are being treated by authorities in some European countries and by European Union-funded agencies in North Africa in particular? The move to a security-alone approach, which has been pushed by some governments under the influence of the hard right, is very dangerous. And it remains the case that security and enforcement takes up 70% of all European Union funding relating to migration and immigration. This means that the organisations which take the lead in supporting integration are left scrambling for funding and are less able to undertake the type of work which would reduce tensions and help both migrants and their host countries. Taoiseach, the future regulation and funding of this sector is currently being discussed at European Union level. Would you advocate for a greater emphasis on integration work?
Deputy Burton.
Well, since your visit to the United States for St. Patrick's Day, I think that President Trump has probably made one of the most profound and historic statements of his presidency so far, in a very eye-catching period for his presidency, when he made a statement in relation to America's future approach to the Golan Heights. Now, I assume that in the context of the Arab Summit, when you were in Egypt, that relationships between Europe and Israel must have been discussed at length, and also the relations of Europe with the Palestinian people. And I would like to know, really, speaking on behalf of the Irish government, what your reaction is to the statement by President Trump, because it's certainly an extraordinarily historic move by the Americans, and it is certainly an area that they have not gone into previously, and it is coming days really before an Israeli election. So I wonder if you've had an opportunity to discuss it with your European counterparts, but more importantly, what is the Irish government's view, and you as the head of the Irish government's view of what President Trump has done. The second thing I wanted to ask you about Sharm el-Sheikh was, did you have an opportunity to discuss climate change? I think everybody who's talked so far has talked about various dreadful conflicts in different parts of the Mediterranean, and many of those have in fact come about partly because of the severity of climate change affecting much of Africa, including North Africa. In particular, we have at the moment in Mozambique and southern African countries, we have the aftermaths of a ferocious storm which has caused massive loss to human life. Now, I don't know if at this stage Irish Aid has actually formally rendered assistance. I know a lot of the Irish aid agencies have, and I want to commend the Irish aid agencies for the help that they're giving to southern Africa in the aftermath of this incredible storm, which I think has been a bigger storm than almost any recorded previously in that part of Africa. And I'm relating the two, because climate change, in terms of wars over resources like water and carbon resources, are a key part of what is driving conflict in all of these regions. And I would just like to know what the Irish government plans to do as a proposal. Also, in the context of Italy's relationship to the Mediterranean, which is long and historic, we now see that populism is very seriously on the march in Italy. I noticed one of your fellow EPP leaders, Mr. Orban, was at the summit, and I just wonder if you could comment on the politics of populism. Mr. Orban, I know his membership now seems to be suspended from the EPP, but he's perfectly happy with that because he's a member, but it's not an active membership apparently at the moment.
Time has elapsed now for this particular group of questions. We have time has elapsed for this group of questions. There are still 2 questioners offering. Now, do we want to? Well, just let's try and decide. Can we take the 2 questions? Well, we may take. Yes, we'll take. Can we take 10 minutes from the remaining sets of questions? So, Deputy Cullinane is next. Can we try and stick to the allocated time? I think everyone's as well able to read the clock as I am.
Taoiseach, in recent times we've seen 2 unilateral acts by the US President Donald Trump in relation to the Middle East and Israel and Palestine most specifically. We saw the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel by the US President, and in recent times since I think the summit, the annexation of the Golan Heights. And both of those acts are unnecessary and dangerous and inflammatory. And I recognise and want to acknowledge the response from the Taoiseach, but I would want to hear your response. And is there an EU-wide and an EU-agreed position in relation to the annexation of the Golan Heights statement and acceptance of that by the US President? We know what the Irish government position is, but is there an agreed European Union government position?
On the same issue, briefly, we have a special interest because our troops are still, as I understand, in the Golan, and in a particularly difficult mission and precarious place. And I do think it's slightly frustrating, I think, in the ongoing debates we have on the issue of Palestine, West Bank, Gaza, but also the wider kind of issue in the region. We keep kind of being told that, the current policy, stick with the current policy and it'll work. When it's clearly these sort of developments showing that I think the policy needs to change, European policy now as well as Irish policy. And I just put that to the Taoiseach that just sitting by and watching the US administration make these sort of changes in terms of recognising Jerusalem through its embassy there, annexing or agreeing or supporting the complete annexation of the Golan Heights, at some point I think Europe has to respond, and I think we should have a strong voice in promoting such an approach.
Can we take maybe 5 minutes for a response? Is that okay? All right, thank you.
Just starting with the questions in relation to the EU-Arab League summit. Migration was, of course, discussed, but it wasn't the focus of the summit. We were very keen that the relationship between Europe and the countries of the Arab League shouldn't be all about migration. A decision was taken that we'd focus on other issues as well. Land Day wasn't discussed, but there was very, very strong recognition from Arab states of Ireland's work at the UN and elsewhere in our support for Palestinians and the role that we play in South Lebanon and other places, and the funding we provide to UNRWA. So there was very strong recognition from the Arab countries that Ireland has been supportive among European countries of the Palestinian cause. Yemen was discussed, climate change was discussed, human rights was certainly raised by me and others. Human rights with regard to women, LGBT citizens, individual liberty, democracy and so on. The nature of the event, though, was that there was a lot of discussion and a lot of views, but very little interaction. It was the first time we've done this. There were roughly 50 heads of state and government present, and it was one of those events where I think it's fair to say that people were giving their views or giving their statements, but not so much work, not so much interaction. There were no working groups, for example. But it was an opportunity to do this. It was the first time we've done it, and we will do it again as the EU and the Arab League, and was a good opportunity for some bilaterals as well, as these events often are. In terms of the Golan Heights, Ireland doesn't recognise Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, never has, and we disagree with the US administration's decision to do so. As I understand it, there's no joint EU position on it. That may follow. That would happen at Foreign Affairs Council or European Council, but because it would fall under the Common Foreign and Security Policy provisions, you'd have to have unanimity or near unanimity to do that. And that is one of the flaws in the Common Foreign and Security Policy, is that it's not done by quality majority voting. So where there isn't unanimity or consensus, the European Union can't take a decision. But of course, moving to qualified majority voting may mean that we end up on the wrong side of a decision on occasion, and that's something we'll have to consider into the future as to whether we're willing to have a strong European Union that can take foreign policy decisions. But the consequence of that is that on occasions we may find ourselves being outvoted on some of those decisions. But we can't keep calling for Europe to act more and Europe to act together more on foreign policy issues if we don't enable Europe to act more by doing so. Deputy Haughey asked, I think, a very pertinent question on what the government's view is on the future of Europe and the future of Europe debate. I think we do need to prepare a policy statement on that. Minister McEntee led a consultation, public consultation on it. And I think post-Brexit, or at least post this phase of Brexit, we should provide that statement and debate here in the Dáil. Our working position is that we support further enlargement, the Capital Markets Union, further deepening of the single market, the digital single market and banking union, and we want to see delivery of the social Europe agenda based on the Gothenburg Declaration. But we don't support a European army, or at least would not participate in one. We don't support tax harmonisation, but that is far too simplistic, and I think it probably deserves a more detailed policy statement once we get through our current difficulties on European policy. In terms of being asked to comment on populism, not sure I can do that in a minute and a half, but I can say I don't like it. There are three essential elements in populism. One is the idea that there's a division between the elites and the people, and only populists can represent the people. Easy solutions to complex and difficult problems that don't work, and the demonisation of opponents. And very much in Ireland we see left-wing populism to the fore rather than right-wing populism, which is what you tend to see in other countries. And those elements of populism I see much more frequently on the far left in Ireland. Elites versus the people, only we can represent the people, demonisation of opponents, simple solutions that don't work. And that's very much a feature, I think, of far left politics in Ireland. We don't really have far right politics in Ireland, and hope we never do. Just in relation to Prime Minister Orbán and Fidesz, that's obviously a party matter, but Fidesz has been suspended now from the EPP. That may result in expulsion down the line. It may result in them rejoining down the line, but that will depend on whether or not they satisfy the criteria that were set down and whether the three wise men who've been appointed to analyse whether they have or not are satisfied. But I would say it is an umbrella group. Everyone in their own group has some parties that perhaps need some further scrutiny. We have now acted. I think certainly the Party of European Socialists needs to consider the situation in Romania, a government led by Social Democrats. That is some serious corruption issues being examined by the European Commission. And I think the Party of European Socialists needs to consider the situation in Britain, an increasingly Eurosceptic-led party with serious issues around anti-Semitism to the extent that Jewish members of Parliament are resigning from the Labour Party in Britain, and I think those. I think those. Well, you know, I think it's always good to clean your own house as well as somebody else's.
Thank you, Taoiseach. We move now to question.